Thank you for joining us today for Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We are uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department. And this year we've been moving sequentially, so we started with DFARS Part 201 in January, and we'll be finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. And in the interest of time, we do not take questions. So if you do have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on 2 of the slides of the presentation today. Virginia PTAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore what PTAC can offer. Set-Aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities alerts assure you won't miss important sources, thought, and solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. And every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. And please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce Government Contractors Council for regular meetings. You can contact Alicia Fields with the email shown on your screen if you do have any questions. T3 Integrated Solutions, a full-service IT provider that specializes in securing our nation's defense industrial base through cloud-based solutions and industry-leading partners. For more than 13 years, C3 has provided boutique tech services, including managed services, security, and Microsoft 365 integration services. C3 specializes in Microsoft government cloud solutions, including GCC, GCC High and Azure Gov, helping clients achieve CMMC, DFARS, and NIST. 800-171 compliance. Additionally, C3 offers an award-winning tailored approach to each client, regardless of size and across a variety of industries. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and more information can be found on our website. I also wanted to inform you of a new series that we are holding this year. We've launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. And this is a live webinar series held each month, and these take place on the second Friday of each month this year at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. So the panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen and then take your live questions about that topic. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals, and you can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available, and you can email hello@jenniferschaus.com for a media kit with pricing details. And please note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each of these webinars. So these are the ones that we're holding for the rest of the year. And more specifically, next month, we are covering Set-Aside with Anna, Eric, Sai, and Tim. And then on November 12th, we get into pricing with Michael, Marsha, Tracy, and Jeff. And then lastly, in December, our speakers, Kate, Brad, and Joshua and Shirley are covering M&A. Again, the code is DFARS to save $15, bringing your cost to $20 per webinar. Additionally, I wanted to highlight a webinar that we're holding this year. The title of that webinar is Fiscal New Year Kickoff Best Practices. And this will be on October 1st at 12 p.m. Both the sponsor link and registration link can be found on your screen and on our website. Our speakers will be covering market research, marketing, sales and capture, proposal writing, and compliance. Sponsorships are also available for this webinar. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for pricing details. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Ned Childs. Welcome, Ned. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Hunter. Again, my name is Ned Childs. I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of McGuire Woods, LLP. We are a full-service government contract practice group within a major international law firm, helping clients with all major government contract issues ranging from contract counseling, small business counseling, utility acquisition counseling, as we'll be discussing today, all the way through to bid protests, claims against the government, prime subcontractor disputes, False Claims Act investigations, Inspector General investigations, really, like I said, the full service spectrum of government contracting, and very much look forward to speaking with you today. Next slide, I guess, moving over to the agenda here. So today we are going to be discussing DFARS Part 241, the acquisition of utility services. Next slide, Tom. So in today's discussion, we're going to start with the basics in FAR Part 41. As you would see if you look at DFARS Part 241, it's largely based on what's in the FAR with some additional supplemental issues that are raised within the DFARS. So we'll start with the general procurement of utility services as part of FAR Part 41, including a discussion of what is a utility service and what's not a utility service, who has the authority to regulate and govern the procurement of utility services, ground rules and procedures for those acquisitions, contract types, and certain of the mandatory contract clauses that are in the FAR. Second, we will pivot to the DFARS specific as to Part 241. And again, here we will look at policy, service and connection charges that are specifically described within the DFARS, and then some of the unique contracting vehicles that are in part of FAR Part 41, but also largely described in additional detail and specific as to DFARS Part 241 to close out today's discussion. So I guess here we can get started. Next slide, please. So first up today is, what is a utility service? We're discussing, as I said, the acquisition of utility services. So the basis of that, or the sort of the ground rules of that, or the base of that, is what actually is a utility service. That term is defined in FAR 41-101, which, as here you see, is a service such as furnishing electricity, natural or manufactured gas, water, sewage, thermal energy, chilled water, steam, hot water, high temperature hot water. It also can be extended to other services where the acquisition is not subject to certain service contract labor standards, but the vast majority of the utility service work that we see is sort of within what you would expect to see what's described as a utility service. So there's typically electricity, gas, water, sewage, and energy-related services. It includes both regulated and unregulated services under the FAR. Next slide, please. So if that is a utility service, then what would not be a utility service? And here, the FAR specifically spells out a number of areas that do not constitute utility services. These areas include cable TV services, natural or manufactured gas when purchased as a commodity, not as a utility. Utility services in foreign countries, though, as we'll discuss in a bit, the DFARS provision does address the general ways through which DoD at least purchases utility services in foreign countries. And then rights and real property, acquisition of public utility facilities, and on-site equipment needed for the facility's distribution or construction maintenance of government-owned equipment and real property. And finally, third-party finance energy shared savings projects authorized by 42 U.S.C. 8287. Now that said, and as we'll describe in a minute as we get into the DFARS, agencies may utilize FAR Part 41 and DFARS Part 241 for energy savings and the purchase of services directly resulting from the implementation of third-party finance savings projects, these energy savings procurement contracts or performance contracts that we'll get into in a minute here. Next slide, please. So who then has the authority to regulate the acquisition of utility services? First and foremost, the GSA has the primary authority for acquiring utility services. This includes such functions as managing public utility services, as well as representing federal agencies in proceedings before both federal and state regulatory bodies. As we'll get into here, and as you'd expect, most of what the federal government does is actually consistent with what public utilities are providing to their regular customers on a day-to-day basis across the country. The GSA obviously has significant experience in this, given their expertise in the acquisition of commercial items and commercial item contracting. So as a result of that, a part of the GSA is tasked with acquiring utility services, given that it generally falls within the agency's area of expertise. Now, these utility contracts generally do not exceed 10 years under 40 U.S.C. 501. And as I said, the authority does include here the managing services and representing agencies before federal and state regulatory bodies. GSA has delegated this authority to both DoD and DOE, as you'll see in the next couple of bullet points here, as well as to the VA, although the delegation to the VA only pertains to any connection charges that are associated with connecting a public utility to a VA location. Now, DoD has its own authority to acquire utility services for military facilities. That's FAR 43-103A2, as supplemented by the DFARS. And DOE also has its own authority to acquire utility services, including but not limited to for uranium enrichment installations, as noted on the slide here. That's FAR 41-103A3. Next slide, please. So ground rules in terms of acquiring utility services or government's acquisition of utility services. First, whatever the government does must be consistent with state law governing the provision of electric utility services, to that extent including state utility commission rulings, electric and utility franchise and service territories, pursuant to state statute regulation or state-approved territorial agreements. And this is generally the same for natural gas and any water services that are governed by state law as well. Agencies are also required to review utility invoices monthly. That's regardless of the type of contract or value of the contract. And then if the acquisition is over the simplified acquisition threshold, agencies are also required to review the services more broadly annually. And that's again pursuant to FAR 41-401. Now, in terms of procedures, this is more interesting for the contracting officers who may be on the webinar here, but contracting officers, as they are with all government procurements, are required to conduct market surveys consistent with FAR Parts 6 and 7, and to ensure that the government is acquiring services pursuant to competitive requirements. Here, it's a little bit different, given that most of the utilities that are being acquired are regulated, and to that extent, many of them are actually monopolistic in the particular service areas. So there's a bit of an issue, not an issue there, but a bit of a curveball there that contracting officers generally understand and are able to kind of work through at the working level. Most interestingly, for utility services, in terms of procedures, if an acquisition is at or below the simplified acquisition threshold, There is actually no bilateral contract needed. It's similar to what a utility would be providing to a standard commercial customer. Our firm's represented a number of utility companies in both compliance and enforcement actions, and it's interesting to work through who the federal customers are for some of these entities, because the only record of it actually being a federal government customer is through the company's billing system. Because if for example, a local post office or something like that is acquiring utilities, those acquisitions are not going to be above the simplified acquisition threshold generally, and are not going to be subject to a formal contract requirement. Now, if the acquisition is above the simplified acquisition threshold, a bilateral contract is needed to include mandatory FAR Part 52 clauses, and it's FAR 52.241-1 through, I believe it's 18 are generally the required clauses. We'll get into those in a second here. Now, there are some exceptions to that. If a utility provider is unwilling to accept those provisions, the government is permitted to waive some of those mandatory provisions, although it has to have an urgent and compelling need, and it has to go above the contracting officer level to more senior officials within the GSA or the acquiring agency in order to gain approval for that. Next slide, please. So contract types, what I would say is both the favored and most likely area that most government agencies, including DoD, are going to acquire utility services from the government is part of what's known as an area-wide contract. Area-wide contracts are between the GSA and a utility service provider, and include the ability to provide services to any federal agency within the franchise territory of that supplier. So if you are utility operating in, I am in the state of Virginia, so we'll use the state of Virginia. If whatever utility service is serving that particular facility, if that utility has an area-wide contract, which is maintained by the GSA, there's a copy of the link that's in the presentation here that lists all of the utility providers with area-wide contracts. The agency can go directly to the utility provider, and again, if it's over the simplified acquisition threshold, it's a fairly easy and automated process to get into the contract there, to effectuate the contract there. All you really need is an SF-26 or SF-33 plus an authorization form that's an appendix to the area-wide contract to establish the connection. If there are necessary construction or connection-related charges, each of the area-wide contracts also authorizes the utility provider to engage in those activities where appropriate, and like I said, authorized by the terms of the contract. As I noted, this is the preferred contract type for each of the specific areas that's covered by an area contract. If an agency or a location wants to go outside of that, they would need either competition, agency head approval otherwise, or an interagency agreement to receive the utility from another government agency, service, or facility. So again, this is usually the area that the mechanism through which most government agencies and locations procure their utility services. Now, like I said, there are two other options. There are interagency agreements. These are used when a facility or agency is acquiring utilities from another government agency, service, or facility. These are generally fairly rare, although a certain number of DoD facilities do have their own utility service facilities and can generate various utilities for some of the surrounding areas. So we have seen some of those in some rare circumstances. In addition, you can contract through separate contracts, and as I noted before, there's competition requirements there, and these are generally used only in absence of an area-wide contract or an interagency agreement. And there's some fairly voluminous documentation requirements in FAR 41205B that must be met in order for the government to follow through and to execute a separate contract in connection with the acquisition of utility services. Next slide, please. Just as an example here, this is what a Exhibit A would typically look like. This is that authorization form that is appended to area-wide contracts, and as you see here, it's very straightforward. It's a single page. This requires the signature of the ordering agency and identification of which of these additional clauses incorporated by reference may be acquired here, and sets forth the location and nature of the service. So again, very, very straightforward and similar to what you would see a public utility use in connection with almost any of their services across the commercial industry. But as I noted, that's the intent of the program, and that's why it is a fairly simple process through the use of a form template such as this. Next slide, please, Hunter. Again, here's a list of the mandatory clauses as part of the FAR that are included in most, if not all, utility service contracts. As I noted, they can be excluded, but it typically takes, at least if it's above the simplified acquisition threshold, higher level approval in order to do so. I'd say the most interesting of which is FAR 52241-7. And this is for regulated services, again, which constitute, I would say probably the majority of the services that are required here, but obviously not all of them, given that not all utilities are regulated. But if there are utility services that are subject to oversight by a regulatory body, that would include rates that are provided by the entity. This would typically include electricity and natural gas, for example. There is a unilateral automatic modification of the area-wide contract that would be connected to any changes to the rates made by the state or local entity that is covering or addressing those regulated services. So again, very straightforward. Again, trying to put the government in the same position as the commercial customer in connection with that. Again, as I noted before, there's a process through which if a utility is required to connect a facility to the public utility, there is the ability for the utility to seek a connection charge in connection with that, and that's again governed by this particular FAR clause here. Next slide, Hunter. A few more mandatory clauses here for specific types of contracts. Nothing here should be particularly surprising, and again, the substance of it's laid out in each of the bullets here. Again, nothing too surprising here or anything like that. Just setting forth the particular standards given the type of service that the contractor and the government would need to agree to in order to provide service charges, to have multiple service locations on a contract outside of an area-wide contract, and certain termination liabilities that could be imposed to the extent that the utility is not charging for a connection charge in connection with connecting the utility to the government facility. Next slide, please. So on to the DFARS itself. DFARS Part 241 is the supplement, that part that specifically pertains to DoD's acquisition of public utilities. There are a number of lead entities by branch. It's the Chief of Engineers of the Army, NAVFAC, the Air Force head of whatever the contracting activities, and DLA are the lead entities for DoD with respect to the acquisition of public utilities. As you see here, there are generally 4 significant policy requirements that are followed by DoD. One, consistent with FAR Part 41. As a matter of comity, DoD complies with the current regulations, practices, and decisions of the independent state regulatory bodies that govern the provision of these utilities in the regular course of business. DoD does not, however, comply with such regulations, practices, or decisions of non-independent regulatory bodies. So that is one thing that we have to advise clients on somewhat regularly. For purchases of utility services outside the United States, again, DoD generally follows the format and technical provisions consistent with local practice, can use multiple language forms and contracts, although those forms have to be in English, at least in one of those languages. So there is some use here or some process here through which DoD can acquire, that the DFARS provides that DoD can acquire utilities outside of the United States. From a FAR Part 15 standpoint, any rates that are established by an independent regulatory body are considered prices set by law or regulation, and are sufficient to set prices without certified cost or pricing data, and a valid basis on which prices can be determined fair and reasonable. Next slide, please. So DoD sets forth some specific order of preference for service and connection charges. As I noted before, service and connection charges are the charges that utilities often impose on customers for either for connecting the customer facility to the public utility. DoD, obviously, from a cost perspective, has a preference for no service and connection charges in connection with the acquisition of public utilities. If that's not available or not practicable, DoD allows for prefers termination liability, and DoD is allowed to use that when it's required to secure the services, but cannot be for more than the agreed connection charge, less any net salvage value material costs. Next is a refundable connection charge, which allows for the DoD to obtain refunds for the connection charge over the course of up to a 5-year period, unless further authorization is provided for by a senior government official. And last and least preferable in the order of precedence is non-refundable connection and service charges. That's generally in connection with the service initiation charge, certain construction charges or construction fees, and membership fees that are required by the supplier's rules and regulations that are required to be paid by all customers. Next slide, please. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this. DoD maintains some broader express regulatory authorities than other agencies with respect to the acquisition of utility services, including the GSA, though, as I noted before, specific as to the energy savings performance contracts, other agencies can and do use those types of contract vehicles. There's an appendix to many area-wide contracts that allow for public utilities to enter into ESPCs pursuant to area-wide contracts, which I'll get into here in a second. As noted on the slide here, one of the most interesting areas of specification or specialty within the DoD structure is what's known as utility privatization. So DoD is authorized to enter into utility service contracts related to the conveyance of utility systems for a period not to exceed 50 years. That's pursuant to 10 U.S.C. 2688. The interesting thing of this is in connection with these types of contracts, the DoD actually conveys both the title to and operation of their own military facility utility systems to the public utility provider, to the utility company, and the utility company then operates the public utility on base as it would the rest of the company's utility network. It's an interesting, like I said, it's an interesting thing because it actually allows for privatization of certain aspects of the federal or the DoD military installation. As part of this, there are certain mechanisms through which, if there are certain capital improvements that need to be made to the public utilities, if upon review of the utility or of the DoD facility utility system, the public utility identifies significant issues with the system, the utility can actually enter into contracts to repair that system before the utility is conveyed to the public utility. So it's actually a very interesting mechanism through which DoD has in the past conveyed title to actual DoD utilities to public utility entities. It's fallen out of favor a little bit over the past few years, but it's something that, at least during prior administrations, has been been explored and implemented fairly fully in certain, at least of our client base here. Next is energy savings performance contracts, or ESPCs. DoD may enter into ESPCs for a period not to exceed 25 years. ESPCs we expect are actually going to be brought back into favor under the current administration. They were out of favor under the last administration. And under these ESPCs, utilities and other companies were allowed to build, for lack of a better term, green energy facilities on government installations, predominantly on DoD installations, but certainly in other locations as well, through which they can, like I said, develop green energy solutions, be it steam generation facilities or solar. We've seen ESPCs relate to the replacement of light bulbs. We've seen ESPCs related to the imposition or the installation of various energy savings mechanisms within power generation facilities, sewage facilities on government facilities. So it is a mechanism through which the government has been trying to go a bit greener over the last, I'd say, probably a decade or two here. And like I said, I suspect it is going to be coming back into favor under the current administration here. One interesting part of that is there are kind of two different areas that the government has explored getting these savings requirements. Some of these contracts actually require contractors to guarantee certain energy savings over the life of the contract, and afford the government the ability to lower the contract price to get a refund related to any of those savings. Others do not require the government to get any particular savings. It's a savings target, not a savings guarantee. So we've seen, at least in our client base, obviously the latter is more has been preferred more significantly by our client base for fairly obvious reasons here. Most, if not all, these contracts also involve third-party financing, given that they involve fairly significant government or contractor construction activities, and the government pays for these contracts through the energy savings. So those savings are generally afforded to the contractor over the full life of the period of performance of the contract. So a lot of these particular contracts are financed through third-party financing arrangements, which result in some interesting compliance considerations that arise during performance of those contracts. And then last but by no means least, DoD also has the authority in a specific regulatory provision in DFARS 217.174 to enter into contracts for electricity from renewable energy sources outside of the ESPC realm. And again, that's something that I suspect we will see potentially more interest in the current administration on a going forward basis here. And I believe that's the end of our slide deck here. Hunter, is that all, I think, from on the deck here?
Yes, I believe so. Just the last slide with your contact information on it.
Great. So yeah, again, Ned Childs, partner from McGuire Woods. Contact information is here. If you have any questions about this presentation, about public utilities under FAR Part 41 or DFARS Part 241, or anything else, quite frankly, related to government contracts, we'd be happy to help. Just let us know. It's been my pleasure to speak with you today. Certainly thank Jennifer Shaw and Associates here, and Hunter in particular, for the opportunity to speak. And I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time and a great presentation. And definitely, like Ned said, reach out with any questions about the content in this webinar. Additionally, the recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we cover more parts of the DFARS. Have a good week, everyone.